Hi, this is Adrian Fontes. This morning during class, some of my students asked me to videotape an explanation that I gave them about what was happening with Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County, Arizona, and in the federal district court right now, April 23rd, 2015. So let's go back to 2007, 2008. And what we had back in those days was a law that was passed in Arizona called 1323-19. This was the human smuggling law that was signed by Governor Janet Napolitano. And again, this was back in 2007, 2008 timeframe. Not all of this is going to be exact, but we want to give you an idea of why we are where we are today. What this law basically was really interesting in the history of American jurisprudence. It was the first time that a state in the Union decided that it wanted to take care of some immigration problems. As you know, in Arizona, there had been a bit of a fervor for years up until this point about illegal immigration in the United States. So the state legislature passed this law, one of the elements of which was if you've got someone that you're transporting who's an illegal alien, you're smuggling human beings. It was a mirror, in a way, of the federal law that has existed since the time of slavery, Arizona's new version. Well, what ended up happening was these laws were upheld by the trial courts, but if you recall, this was the time when people were being prosecuted for conspiracy to smuggle themselves. And anybody knows that a conspiracy requires two people, not just the person who's being smuggled. And so that stopped happening, but this law stayed on the books. Let's fast forward a little bit until 2008, 2009 timeframe. We had something in Arizona called SB 1070. Now, a lot of people talk to this as if it was the Papers, Please law. And the difficulty that this law had in front of Judge Bolton, and that's Susan R. Bolton in the federal district court in Arizona, she struck down several portions of this law because basically what it says was that local law enforcement agents, if they had a reason to believe that someone was in the country illegally, they could stop them and ask them for their papers, essentially making every law enforcement agent in the state a federal immigration agent. And so Judge Bolton basically struck down several portions of this. The Ninth Circuit struck down a few more, and one portion finally ended up in the United States Supreme Court. So we've got SB 1070 that was challenged through the courts over time. And again, we're giving you a Reader's Digest version here, so we might miss some details, but let's move forward. While this law was being challenged in through the courts, Sheriff Arpaio decided that he was going to do immigration sweeps and continue to enforce the law, regardless of what the courts had said. And so basically what he was doing is he was stopping all of these folks, what were called immigration sweeps. And these individuals felt like their civil rights were being violated here in the United States because they were being stopped based on the color of their skin, not because they were committing any other crimes. And that's illegal. And so what ended up happening is the ACLU decided that they were going to bring a lawsuit against Sheriff Arpaio. Now, this is what we're still litigating today, and this is the course of the hearings that we've been going through in the testimony are part of this case, not part of this case. Remember, this is a constitutional challenge about SB 1070 and whether or not it's legal. This case that's going on right now is about the violation of the civil rights of these individuals, including all Latinos here in Maricopa County, by the sheriff, and that came from the ACLU. Well, the judge that heard this case is named Judge Snow. Now, Judge Snow comes from a pioneering Mormon family here in Arizona. He's been on the Arizona Court of Appeals. He was appointed by President George W. Bush to the bench and will serve for the rest of his life in the federal district court. Judge Snow did the trial in this case, and it was a bench trial. There was no jury, but it was a trial to the court. And after the bench trial, Arpaio and his folks were found guilty. They were found guilty of violating the civil rights of these individuals. Now, what happens after somebody is found guilty during a trial? Well, you've got to have some penalties, right? And so in this case, the sheriff was ordered to do a variety of things at the sheriff's department to make sure that the people in Maricopa County were not being mistreated or treated illegally. The sheriff decided that he wasn't going to do these things. But not only that, he had 4 other guys who, along with him in his chain of command, also decided that they weren't going to do these things. Eventually, the ACLU came back to the judge and they said, hey, Judge, you found these guys guilty of committing some bad acts. You gave them some punishments, but they're not following through. And so we'd like you to enforce your order to make sure that this happens. So what does Judge Snow do? Judge Snow decides that he's going to have a contempt hearing. A contempt hearing is a hearing that the court can put on when somebody's not following their orders. We've already had a trial where the sheriff and his folks were allowed to present all the evidence that they wanted to present and do all of these other things so that they could defend themselves. And they were found guilty. Then they decided not to follow these orders. We're going to take a step back over here now and fill in some blanks on a little bit of a backstory. But let's not forget, that's not the only thing that's happening. Way back over here in 2008, the Department of Justice opened up an investigation. This investigation was talking about whether or not folks' civil rights were violated, not only by the human smuggling law and the execution of that human smuggling law from the Sheriff's Department, but also by SB 1070. This lawsuit that we were talking about a moment ago came after the beginning of this Department of Justice investigation. Now remember, this is a 2008 investigation. It started under George W. Bush's presidency and under George W. Bush's Department of Justice. So people who say, well, it's politically motivated, they got to check their calendars. From 2008 to 2015, the same Department of Justice did an investigation. They have over 600, as I understand, interviews, thousands and thousands of pages of evidence. And if you recall over the last several years, this investigation has been popping its head up and down. And the sheriff has been saying, oh, it's a witch hunt, we're fully cooperating, everything is just fine, there's nothing to worry about, it's politically motivated, and so on. Well, we know that the opposite is exactly true. What we do know is that the Sheriff's Department has been stalling and not giving information to the Department of Justice. We also know that it wasn't politically motivated because of the way that it started. Not only that, but today, the Department of Justice issued a press release indicating that Sheriff Arpaio and his office violated the Constitution and violated federal law. The thoroughness of a report that lasts this long and the volume of evidence is really damning against the sheriff. But this is a separate issue than what's happening in the court right now. Let's head back over here and talk about this stuff. This contempt hearing that's happening in Phoenix right now played out in a very interesting way. Sheriff Arpaio and his 4 co-defendants, after having been found guilty and given the possibility of these penalties, didn't do what they were supposed to do. And so the ACLU, as the plaintiff in the case, said, on behalf of our clients, we want you to hold the sheriff in contempt because he's not following your orders. And so the judge says, okay, let's have a hearing. In January, he sets a hearing for April. The very hearing that we're in right now. Not too long after that, Sheriff Arpaio and one of these 4 go to the judge and they say, hey judge, we're guilty and we're willing to tell you that we're guilty. As a matter of fact, we're going to give you a document that says we're going to tell you that we're guilty. Now anybody that knows anything about the system knows that numbers are important. If you've got 2 of these 5 saying that, hey judge, we're going to plead guilty, guess what the other 3 have done? Well, they've turned rat and they're going to testify against these 2 guys over here. And so for these 2 guys to save their skin and not have the other 3 testify against them, they went to the judge with their tails between their legs and they said, we want to admit guilt. Please don't go forward with the hearing. Obviously, the hearing has gone forward, and guess why? Because the judge said something super interesting. Not just to Joe Arpaio and the one other guy, but to everybody. Judge Snow said, I will consider a settlement in this case, and I will consider canceling the hearing if I get a universal agreement. Guess what that means? A universal agreement means that every single party has to be fully satisfied. And so the ACLU was in the driver's seat on this settlement. Not only that, but the Department of Justice has been participating in this as well. So Sheriff Arpaio ended up in a position where he had to do what the ACLU said. We didn't get there. We've got this contempt hearing going on this week. During the course of this contempt hearing so far, we've had rat number 1, rat number 2, and rat number 3 who decided to testify against Joe Arpaio. Testified. And they said some stuff that really doesn't help the sheriff at all. Not only that, but we found out today, this very morning, that Sheriff Arpaio was asked by the judge himself if the sheriff had been investigating the judge and the judge's wife. Really damning stuff. The sheriff has to have his tail between his legs and say, yes, judge, I was investigating you and your wife. That's not going to help when we get to the punishment phase. Okay, we're almost done here, and I want to make sure that we understand where we're at. But to do that, we want to go back and take a little bit of a history lesson. Let's not forget that in 1986, Ronald Reagan instituted an amnesty in the United States, and it was fought against by the Democrats. See, the Democrats were backed up by the labor movement. And the labor guys didn't want all this cheap labor coming into the United States market. Well, the Republicans, the pro-business guys, wanted the cheap labor, and they ended up getting what they wanted. So we had this huge amnesty in 1986. Fast forward to the year 2001. George W. Bush had just gotten elected, and he was cozying up with Vicente Fox down in Los Pinos, which is the Mexican White House, and they were working together to try to lobby Congress to do another amnesty. By the end of the summer of 2001, at the beginning of George W. Bush's presidency, it looked like we were going to get another amnesty under President George W. Bush. It was real close, and then 9/11 happened. Well, we all know what happened after that. There was a big turn against folks who were not quote-unquote American enough for everybody else. And so those worries about Al-Qaeda coming in over the borders and people coming and trying to harm us really gave rise to this fear. This fear resulted in the fervor against illegal immigrants, specifically from Central and South America and Mexico. Not only that, but it was coupled with a rising drug war in the early 2000s. And that's why we ended up with the laws that we ended up with. So we end up with a sheriff who ends up violating the civil rights of a lot of folks. He's found guilty of doing that by a court in a bench trial. These penalties are imposed. He decides not to do these things. Fast forward to the contempt hearing, where these guys are all basically testifying against each other, and the judge gets the sheriff to admit to himself that the sheriff was investigating the judge and his wife. So basically what's happening here, and to wrap this all up, again, thanks for watching, is there's two things happening right now that are super important. Number one, we have this contempt hearing, and we need to know what the penalties are. If the judge finds the sheriff and his cohort in contempt of court based on not following these orders over here, this is civil contempt. It's not criminal contempt. As a civil contempt case, the judge has a limited amount of remedies that he can impose onto the sheriff. But if he's found guilty of civil contempt during the hearing that's happening now, he could then be charged with criminal contempt. And this possible case has to do with the fact that Sheriff Joe wouldn't follow Judge Snow's orders from the penalties on this bench trial. Number two, and again, that's only the first one. Number two is the DOJ investigation. Again, this was announced today, and just today, the other shoe drops. The DOJ said that Sheriff Arpaio has violated the Constitution and that he's violated several federal laws. So where do we see Sheriff Joe in the future? We're not really sure yet, but right now, you're in a position to better understand a lot of the history of what happened, why these things worked the way they did, and how it is that we do have two very major movements happening. Another thing happened today. The Department of Justice has a new chief, and that's Loretta Lynch. The United States Senate confirmed her appointment today. And Loretta Lynch, as an African-American woman, has a stellar reputation among Democrats and Republicans alike for being a straight-up prosecutor. She also understands that law enforcement officials across the United States have not been acting well. So if someone was going to predict whether or not there needs to be a symbolic fall of a high-profile law enforcement officer so that the Department of Justice can justify moving forward and helping folks get along better with police and vice versa, this would be a great opportunity. My name is Adrian Fuentes. I'm an adjunct professor at Phoenix College. I'm also an attorney in private practice. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you've got any questions or comments, go ahead and post them down here. Again, thanks for watching.